Welcome to another episode of the channel. Today, you will understand how Chinese President Xi Jinping is planning to win the new Cold War that is already underway against the United States, and, more importantly, how he believes he can avoid the same mistakes that have destroyed the Soviet Union. To understand Xi's current strategy, we need to go back a few decades for one of the most tense periods of the 20th century. The Cold War. After the end of World War II, the planet was divided into two rival blocs. On the one hand, the United States, representing democratic capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union, symbol of authoritarian communism. These two giants never faced each other directly on the battlefield, but fought a silent and brutal war by global influence. Therefore, the term Cold War describes this confrontation well. A war of spying, propaganda, arms race, and ideological disputes, but in practice left traces of destruction in various conflicts by power of attorney around the world. For many years, the Soviet Union seemed to have the strength to face the United States on the same as an equal. Its heavy industry produced weapons at a frantic rhythm, and its military power grew. But suddenly and humiliating, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. This has raised a doubt that to this day haunts communist leaders. How could such a powerful empire fall like this? The answer is not only in the external clash, but especially in Soviet internal problems. The centralized economy was extremely inefficient and heavy. Soviets invested fortunes in weapons and military technology, but left domestic consumption in the background. Basic goods, innovation, and economic freedom were missing. Moreover, ideological control was suffocating and brutal political repression. This combination caused the people to lose faith in the regime, especially in the countries of Eastern Europe, such as Eastern Germany, Poland, and Baltic nations, which lived under the strong influence of the capitalist West. Over time, the Soviet Communist Party has lost popular loyalty and even the support of the elites. When Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform the system in the 80s, with the famous Glasnost policy, opening, and perestroika, restructuring, it was too late. The Soviet regime was eroded inside. Without economic strength, no real allies, and no popular legitimacy, the empire simply imploded. Now imagine someone who has followed all this closely, analyzing every detail as a warning. This man is Xi Jinping. Born in 1953, at the height of the old covenant between China and Soviet Union, Xi grew up seeing the Chinese charm with Moscow and then the bitter rupture between the two countries. His father, Xi Jinping, was a high Chinese leader who even studied in the Soviet Union, bringing home the admiration for the Moscow model. This deeply marked the young Xi Jinping. However, with the Soviet collapse, Xi began to study obsessively that episode. He turned the Soviet collapse into a true error manual to be avoided. Still in the days when he drove the central school of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi used the example of the Soviet Union as a constant warning. He always repeated that Soviet failures should never be repeated in China. 11 came to the conclusion that 3 errors were fatal to Moscow: to allow ideological erosion, tolerate political decentralization, and lose control over society. Therefore, she defends a hard political line, with full ideological control and repression of any movement contrary to the Communist Party. But there is a crucial difference between him and the former Soviet leaders: his economic view. Xi Jinping believes that it is possible to maintain absolute control over political and ideological power, but at the same time adopt a flexible economic approach to the world. Shortly after assuming power in 2012, Xi ordered the production of an official documentary about the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the movie, Mikhail Gorbachev is portrayed as a traitor who abandoned the Communist Party and destroyed the country. The message Xi wanted to pass was crystal clear: China will not repeat the same error. But this stance would be placed to the test a few years later, in 2017, with the arrival of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States. Trump adopted an aggressive policy, placing China in the target. He imposed rates on Chinese products, applied sanctions against technology companies, and started a diplomatic containment movement. The height of this tension occurred in 2018 with the so-called trade war. China was taken by surprise by the American offensive, and Xi Jinping soon realized they were already living a new Cold War, this time against an even more prepared and powerful enemy. After the trade war began by Donald Trump, Xi Jinping understood that the time to observe was over. He needed to act, and fast. In 2020, Xi revealed his main strategic card, a plan called double circulation. The goal was clear and ambitious: to ensure that China reached internal self-sufficiency, but without giving up trade with the rest of the world. Unlike the Soviet Union, which has been economically isolated, Xi wants China to survive alone, but also maintain the role of protagonist in global commerce chains. Xi Jinping's plan is meticulously built on 4 central axes, pillars that, according to him, will prevent China from repeating the Soviet collapse. The first axis is economic diversification and self-sufficiency. Here, the focus is to shield the Chinese economy against foreign sanctions and blockages. Unlike Soviets, who have concentrated everything in the heavy and arms industry, Xi wants China to produce everything from chips and semiconductors to drugs and cutting-edge weapons. The order is clear. China needs to be self-sufficient in critical technology and strategic products. The goal is to ensure that, even in the face of external commercial boycotts and barriers, the country remains supplied, with its domestic consumption preserved. The second axis is to avoid geopolitical isolation. Xi Jinping knows that isolation was one of the great errors of the Soviet Union. While Moscow created a closed and hostile bloc to the West, Xi wants to keep China connected to the world. Therefore, China invests billions of dollars in the so-called Global South, offering loans and partnerships to countries from Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. In addition, it strengthens its influence on forums such as BRICS and the Belt and Route Initiative, which finances infrastructure works in dozens of countries. The goal is clear: to weaken Western alliances and promote multipolarity, that is, a world where power is not only concentrated in the West. The third axis is sustainable and cautious military growth. Xi Jinping also learned a lesson with Soviet bankruptcy. The unbridled arms race is a way for collapse. While the Soviets spent to the last penny in tanks and missiles, Xi bets on more calculated military growth. Currently, China's defense budget grows about 7.2% per year, well above GDP growth, but still controlled. The focus is not only on quantity, but in the modernization of the armed forces, Navy, Air Force, long-range missiles, and especially cyber war and space technology. For Xi, the goal is not to provoke an immediate confrontation, but to build a military force of deterrent and keep the country prepared for any scenario. Finally, the fourth axis, and for Xi the most important, is absolute ideological control. It is exhaustive in stating that the survival of the Chinese Communist Party is above all. Therefore, no ideological fissures are tolerated. The party strictly controls all aspects of Chinese life: the educational system, social media, universities, economics, and even culture. It is a brutal party dictatorship with no margin for dissent. The regime is not limited to controlling. It dictates what people should think, what they should study, what they should consume, and how they should act. She believes it was precisely the loss of ideological control that destroyed the Soviet Union, and he is determined to avoid this at any cost. But Xi Jinping's ambition doesn't stop there. In the international field, China also adopts a strategic and patient approach. Taking advantage of the weakening of U.S. external assistance agencies, such as the end of USAID, which for decades has funded social projects in poor countries, Beijing acts quickly to occupy the vacuum left by Washington. With this, China expands its presence in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, offering credit, building hospitals, railways, and ports. This strategy is called soft power, the power of indirect influence, conquering allies not by military force, but by charisma and economic support. And there is a curious detail. USAID itself was created during the Cold War, precisely to contain communist expansion. Now, ironically, China tries to apply in the 21st century the same formula that the United States has used in the past. Xi Jinping believes that by offering an image of a friendly and cooperative country, he will be able to attract nations that today feel threatened or abandoned by the United States. While Washington hardens his policies and imposes sanctions, Beijing presents himself as a safe haven for emerging nations. And all this is part of the same plan, from preventing China from repeating the Soviet collapse. While Xi Jinping consolidates his internal and external strategy, he is fully aware that the biggest challenge of the new Cold War goes far beyond the traditional military field. Today, the global dispute is locked in areas such as advanced technology, strategic supply chains, artificial intelligence, and, especially, information control and ideology. China wants to master the most critical sectors of the digital and technological economy, ensuring that its independence is not compromised by blockages or embargoes. Chips, semiconductors, software, and hardware are the new battlefield where global supremacy will be decided. At the same time, she knows that the ideological control of the population is fundamental to support the power of the long-term Communist Party. Therefore, the Chinese government has intensified censorship on social networks, controls the internet with one of the most rigorous systems in the world, and regulates educational content to align young people with the official vision. Political repression and constant monitoring are part of this policy, which 11 sees as essential to avoid any crack that can weaken the party or make way for internal contestation movements, which, according to him, was fatal to the Soviet Union. Internationally, China also adopts a more aggressive stance on diplomacy. Instead of direct confrontations, Beijing bets on calculated actions, such as the expansion of his influence on multilateral organisms and the strengthening of strategic partnerships with emerging countries. With the creation of alternative economic blocs and heavy investment in world infrastructure, China seeks to create a new global system where Washington is no longer the center of power. The idea of a multipolar world order with several influential powers is a key piece for Xi Jinping. Still, despite all this confidence in his long-term plan, she knows that the path will not be easy. The United States remains a military and technological superpower, and its responses to Chinese actions may be unpredictable. Uncertainty about how Washington will react to Chinese efforts to expand its global influence and maintain economic self-sufficiency creates a scenario of constant tension. For Xi, the time factor is an ally. His view is to think of decades, not short electoral cycles, as is common in the West. In short, Xi Jinping outlines a path where total party control, technological advancement, self-sufficient economic growth, and international influence are keys to prevent the fate of the Soviet Union and ensure that China emerges as the dominant power of the 21st century. This new Cold War, therefore, is a battle not only for tanks and missiles, but for ideas, technology, and economic power. The world observes attentive, knowing that the future geopolitical will depend on decisions made today by Beijing and Washington.